the same officer that had originally said that all three were deceased notices that Josie was in fact alive.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised.
This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grove Secrets. We're your hosts. I'm Beth.
I'm Annie, and today what have we got?
A case study.
I love it when we say that. We always say we've got another
We should
case
just
study.
say
Today's case is. So,
and then if it's a different kind of episode, it's a bonus.
Yeah, we'll start doing that. I feel very repetitive. So we are covering the case today of Lynn and Megan Russell, and it's in a good order, this one, isn't it? Because I feel like, unlike last week's episode where we're backwards and forwards a bit, this is pretty straightforward from start to finish. So it is a really chilling case, and we are going to unravel the events of Tuesday the 9th of July 1996, where a mum was out walking with her two daughters and their family dog, where they were viciously attacked. They were on the way home from school, from a swimming gala, and this was in broad daylight.
Yeah, what's horrific is that it was the mum that had decided to take like the scenic route home, and ultimately it was just that decision that had proved fatal. Obviously she'd had no idea,
but it was a route she took home. Well, they'd all walked that route many times before.
So again, we've mentioned it in other cases, but a really gorgeous area. So it's in Kent, in an area called Chillenden. But then specifically in this case, it was the village of Nonnington.
I think they call Kent, don't they, the Garden of England, because it's so like beautiful and scenic. But I've actually never been to Kent. So
I have once, but it was for a uni visit, so it was quite a fleeting one.
In and out.
I just thought it'd be good because my surname's Kent, so I wanted to live there. Hated the uni. But yeah, so it's a gorgeous area. And we've said before about like it's in a nice area, like a suburb, housing estates, but they tend to be more typical. This is actually
a nice
gorgeous
area. It's like close to Canterbury.
Obviously it reminded me of Midsummer Murders.
Yeah,
it's that kind of big stone, like old school country houses, little kind of back roads that are full of bulberry bushes, and
it is so like homely. It's where you would go, and it's where people would want to bring up a family and where they would want to live. So that is exactly what Sean and Lynn Russell did. So they lived there with their two daughters, Megan, who was 6, and Josie, who was 9, in a very quiet, scenic part.
And they both went to primary school in the neighbouring village, which was Goodiston. Sean worked at the local university. And Lynn Russell, I'm not sure if she worked,
she had been an academic, so they were both classed as doctors. But since having the children, Lynn had then took the time off and become a stay-at-home mom. But Sean had got the job at the university, and instead of commuting, because I think they could have commuted if he really wanted to, but they realised it was going to be a lot less family time because he's going to be commuting home, so they just relocated the whole family there.
So it's a gorgeous area, and as we've mentioned, so Lynn decides to take the girls a scenic route home. They'd been at this primary school and they'd got picked up about 4 p.m. They're laden down with all their swimming stuff.
They'd been to like a swimming gala, which was out of school. So they've sort of been on like a school trip.
Yeah.
And they'd arrived back at school at 4 p.m, whereas they would normally finish school a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and it was actually like a friend, wasn't it, or a family friend that had taken them from the gala back to the school.
Yeah, to get
and
picked
then
up.
Lynn was then picking them up from the school.
Yeah.
So a pretty exciting day.
Yeah.
Again, they're only young, so 9 and 6.
They'd have been so excited to tell the mum about it as well, weren't they? I feel like you can just imagine them running out of school. They've got swimming bags, they've got lunch boxes,
Yeah.
they've got the school stuff.
And it was a gorgeous, obviously we're talking like July time, and so gorgeous like early evening
Yeah.
in summer, warm, and hence why they decided to go the scenic route. And when I talk about a scenic route, literally over the fields.
Yeah.
So like through a gate at the end of the road, over, I think it was 2 fields.
Yeah.
And then out onto a little lane. And again, they've done it hundreds of times before.
And even the lane where they came out was called Cherry Garden Lane. And I was like,
I know.
how cute is that? And the cottage that they lived in was, I think it was called Granary Cottage.
Mm.
And all the names of these things, I was just like, oh, it just sounds
Whimsical.
like so, yeah, it sounds so nice. It's like what
Yeah.
you'd read about in a book, isn't it?
Yeah. So Lynn had also got the family dog. I didn't find a name for the family.
Lucy.
Lucy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they'd actually got 2 dogs. They'd got like an old retriever type dog.
Okay.
But because that dog was so old, it couldn't come on the long walk. So she'd
Whereas
only got Lucy with her.
Lucy loved a walk.
Lucy was a little one, I think, small dog.
So it's Lynn off to pick up the girls with the dog Lucy, and then she picks up her 2 daughters, Megan and Josie. It should have been about a 20-minute journey. So again, over the fields, it would have taken about 20 minutes. And what we kind of believe to have happened is that about 4:10, they'd have reached the gate that, as we mentioned, then led them to the lane, Cherry Garden Lane. Again, hedgerows either side of it, like just a very quiet,
It was
off the
almost
beaten
like
track.
a sort of cobbled road in a way, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Not like cobbled road, like a dirt track.
Yeah, you could have got like, it was probably a single car, road.
Yeah, not
but
like an...
where there's like little divots for other cars to overtake.
And you're quite far away here from any sort of like built up area, aren't you?
So the girls were obviously on their way home, and Sean Russell commuted back, came home, and the girls weren't there. He was obviously worried, so decided to go out in his car and retrace the steps that they'd have taken to get back from the school.
Yeah, he was sort of wondering, are they actually, as the plans changed?
Yeah.
But would she have, Lynn would probably have rang if something would have changed, so he checked the answer machine messages. And you've got to think at this time, in this year, what are we, 1996?
Yeah.
You can't just pick up a mobile phone like we would now and like either track someone or call them or send them a message. Like if Lynn wanted to get in touch with Sean at home, she would have had to either go and find a phone box somewhere.
Yeah.
So it's not as easy as obviously it is now at all.
And when he'd returned home, he returned about 7:30.
Yeah.
So that's a good few hours that the girls should have been at home.
Yeah.
Probably, getting ready to have tea, stuff like that. So, as I mentioned, he then went out to have a look for them, couldn't find them. So by the time it got to 9 o'clock at night, obviously he's very worried
by now.
And he then calls the police.
I think at first he thought like, the dog might have ran off or, something could have happened like that where there's a reasonable explanation.
Yeah.
And I heard some like quotes from him, and he was saying that he was just hoping that they were all of a sudden going to come out of nowhere and be all embarrassed because he'd rang the police, and that there would be a reasonable, like a justifiable explanation for everything that had happened.
Just like one big misunderstanding.
Yeah, and he said that when he first rang the police, he almost felt guilty for ringing them, as if like, did it justify ringing the police? But as time got on, he soon was getting more worked up and more worried about his family.
Yeah. So bear in mind he's rung up at about 9. They did take this, again, as seriously as they should have done right from the off. So by 10:30... the search has already begun at this stage. Officers had gone out. Now, the only I say the only problem with this is that because it's late evening now, there is no natural light. So your search automatically is a lot more difficult because you're working limited against the light. Yeah. And in these rural areas, it's not built up with lighting from buildings, street lights, that kind of thing.
It will have actually been pitch black. Yeah. So in the time that the girls have been missing, Sean has obviously been out to look for them. He has rang the police. They've started the search. He also rings round hospitals and he rings round Lynn's friends. So he gets in touch with one of Lynn's friends, Liz, and they've got children at the same school, so their kids are friends as well.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, well, I tried to ring up earlier, actually, because after the school gala and the swimming gala, I spoke to Lynn and we have got they had a brownies induction for the kids that night. Right. So Liz said to Lynn, well, I tell you what, I'll come round to your house, I'll pick the kids up and I'll take them to the brownie induction together so they can all go off. Anyway, she turned up at the house at 5 o'clock to pick them up, or 5:30, and there was no one in the house. So she thought, oh, maybe there's been a change of plans or whatever. So she just took her daughter and dropped her off at Brownies. It wasn't until she picked her daughter up from Brownies that she realised that Josie and Megan weren't there.
Yeah.
So she was like, well, that's a bit strange, isn't it? So she then rang the house to check on Lynn to see if she was okay.
Yeah.
So when she found out that her friend was missing, obviously, if it's like your best friend, she said, well, I'm really worried, so I'm going to come round to the house.
Yeah.
So her and her husband both went round to the house and stayed with Sean while the police were there and while they were all out doing the searching. So I think that was really nice of her to make sure that you've got, 'cause at this point, all of his family are missing. He's and totally on his own.
And you would have gone from thinking this is just going to be a misunderstanding and they're going to turn up to by 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, you are going to be thinking worst case scenario, aren't you, probably?
Yeah.
You'd be thinking all of the things, all of the emotions, all of the possibilities.
And Sean's actually tried to retrace the steps already and there's no sign of him. Yeah. And he actually drove down Cherry Garden Lane.
Yeah.
So he drove down there really slowly. He was looking to see if there was the dog had run off in the fields or anything like that.
And it is just odd, isn't it? Because like you've just said, Lucy the dog was missing too. So it's like they've just all vanished into thin air.
Yeah, because if something had happened usually to Lynn and the kids...
Yeah.
Dogs are very responsive, aren't they? And would probably run back home to alert someone.
Back home or gone and find a person and then they guide people back to if
They're very clever.
Yeah.
So for everyone just to have fully disappeared. So
really
the police have obviously started the search, but are finding it increasingly difficult at this point.
So by 12:30, they are doing the same route that Sean has kind of already tried to look, just obviously a lot more thorough because there's a whole team of investigators. And
they'll be doing it on foot as well. So Sean went down the Cherry Garden Lane in his car. Yeah. But officers will probably have gone back, started at the school, and walked through all the fields doing one of the field searches.
Yeah, so they were using torches as well because that's all they'd got. And eventually, between 12:15 and 12:30, an officer that was searching the crop fields, because as we mentioned, this lane that they'd have crossed and then gone down had fields either side. So you've got built up kind of bushes either side of the lane, but then either side of that you've then got fields.
Yeah.
And it was a crop field.
There's a lot of open area to search.
But ultimately one of the officers does then come across all three victims. So we've got Josie, her sister Megan, and then Lynn, the mother, as well as Lucy the dog, all deceased, all appear to have been murdered, showing no signs of life as far as they were aware.
And at this point, I just can't think what Sean will be going through, because officers then obviously went straight to Sean's house and had to tell him that all of his family were dead. His whole family. I think they were saying at the time he sort of went into a state of shock, and it didn't hit him straight away.
No.
But then in this situation, the police now know that there's suspicious circumstances, and the first usual point of call is the husband. So they started talking to him and asked him to come down to the police station. And Lynn's friend Liz was actually saying, don't go down, stay here with us, because I can see the questions they're asking you.
Yeah.
But then he was like, no, I'm going to go.
I've got nothing to hide.
Yeah, I'm going. And apparently when he got in the police car, he just fully broke down. He spoke about like ending it all because he'd lost all his family. And then he was took into the police station for questioning. So he was in there until I think it was at least 6 a.m. that morning.
It's just, it's horrific. And another thing as well is you kind of think there's no right reaction, is there? Obviously him kind of shutting down and being in shock at first, people could see that as being, there's so many ways to interpret, and this is exactly why it's difficult when you see cases like this on the media, because everyone always jumps to conclusions. If he doesn't react enough, it's seen as being disingenuous and that he doesn't care. If he then breaks down and is overly emotive, I'm doing that in inverted commas for anyone that's listening, and is then talking about ending his life, people are going to say that that's because he's guilty.
You just can't win.
This is the problem with like press conferences of families. You know, sometimes when they've got a missing child and they're pleading for him to come home, there's so many people that are saying no, they know something. So you can understand why the friend Liz was kind of cautious of it.
Because she knew that it wasn't Sean, that he would never have done anything to hurt his family. But the injuries were absolutely horrific. They all had blunt force trauma, and they'd been hit in the head. They were like 15 times, 7 times, 16 times. Like, these are horrendous injuries, and they got fractured skulls. There was even some of the brain matter exposed. So you can just imagine, even the officers who found the bodies, how much of an awful scene this was.
Completely traumatising. Another thing I've just thought of as well is obviously Sean kind of retraced their route and has now been on that lane. So another thing that you think is, well, are they going to claim that he retraced the steps so that if his DNA or if he's found as having been there, it's an excuse because he was looking to find them? It's just one of those where there's so many different hypotheticals, isn't there?
I also thought with that one as well, like, how bad would he have felt because he actually drove down Cherry Garden Lane not knowing that his family were laid dead over
probably
like
meters
away from him. And wouldn't you think like, oh, if I'd have just looked over this wall, or if I'd have just looked around this corner, would I have been able to save them? And that's something that he will have in his head forever, for the rest of his life.
So obviously we've said that he was then in the police station and being questioned till about 5 o'clock in the morning. If we go back a little bit, obviously there are no signs of life. As you've mentioned, the scene itself was absolutely horrific. So investigators are then processing the scene as a murder scene with 3 victims. By 1:30, as I say, they're fully investigating and examining the scene, and all of a sudden, the same officer that had originally said that all 3 were deceased notices that Josie was in fact alive because her chest was moving and they could see that she was still breathing.
So this is an hour or over an hour after discovering the bodies. So they know now that Josie's going to need urgent medical attention. And at this point, they didn't even know that it was Josie. They just knew that one of the daughters had survived. So the officer actually picked her up and took her over to the car. They got to the hospital, and then I think she had to go by air ambulance to the main hospital.
By 2 a.m, she was in hospital. But obviously had extensive head injuries.
And the doctors at this point are fighting to save her life, but they're saying, with these injuries, we don't really know what can happen. She's probably not going to make a full recovery, or might not even survive this with the extent of these injuries. So it's
miraculous that she'd even survived an hour after.
But when the attacks were, she survived all that time.
Yeah, that's it's
it's crazy, isn't
that's
it?
what I mean. It's miraculous because I mean, even if she'd have survived the initial head injuries from when the attack happened, even a couple of hours, never mind. Then we're now on to the following day, effectively, like early hours.
Yeah, it's like nearly 12 hours.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
So again, now we're talking early hours of the morning, and the investigation can ramp up at this stage because they have now got daylight on their side, which obviously makes an awful lot of difference.
Yeah.
By 8:30 a.m, again, news had broken. So in a lot of these cases, obviously it's a small idyllic area. You have, messages come through on the police radios, and that's effectively how news sources had heard about the case.
Yeah.
And that there were 3 horrific murders. They were still saying that there were 3 at that point as well, which obviously, again, would make sense.
So all the reporters are going to be now preparing their stories for basically the 9 o'clock news, aren't they, at this point?
So that was first thing in the morning. And again, this is where we talk about the media being like a hindrance and a help. Obviously, everyone's going to be putting their 2 pence in as to what they think's happened, who they think's responsible. Scaremongering as well. There'd be a lot of like killer on the loose type narrative. However, because it came out so early on in the day, a witness actually came forward pretty quickly.
So it's, in this case, it did.
So yeah, it has its benefits and its kind of drawbacks. But this witness stated that they'd been walking the previous afternoon around that area, and along that same lane, they'd seen a man standing by the boot of his car. The boot was open, and they said that something just didn't seem right. He seemed a bit
Just odd. Like acting odd, yeah.
Yeah. So they obviously continued their walk, but they actually decided to walk past again to see if that same person was there. The person in the car had gone, but what he noticed then was a swimming bag of towels that appeared to be heavily bloodstained. So obviously officers their ears are gonna prick up at that stage.
Yeah.
This is sounding significant. Obviously, we now know that the girls had been at the swim gala, so they'd have had a bag of towels with them.
It's probably one of the first pieces of evidence as well for the police at this point, isn't it?
Yeah. And they then obviously ask for a description of both the vehicle and this man that had been seen. They couldn't give an awful lot of detail, but they did say that the person looked between the age of 35 to 40, light coloured hair, and that it was a beige car.
Yeah. It is quite a vague description, isn't it?
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's a start for the police. But when we say about the media as well, I've just remembered that when the news first broke about this, by this point, Sean had actually been told that because he was still in the police station, he'd been told that one of his daughters was still alive. So he asked which one, and the police officers said, we don't know which one it is. So he said, has she got freckles? Because one of his daughters had got freckles and one hadn't. So they rushed Sean from the police station to the hospital to be by his daughter's side.
Yeah.
And it turned out that it was Josie. But in all the midst of this, and obviously how hectic it is for Sean, because he's been brought in to be questioned until 6 a.m. in the morning. He's found out...
Thought he'd lost his whole family.
Then he's found out that Josie's alive. And he said he went to the... this is actually from his book. And he went to the hospital canteen to get a cup of coffee. And while he was sat there, he looked up and the news was on the TV. And he knew it was about his family. And he had to run and find a police officer to then ring Lynn's mom and dad. And it was too late, and they'd found out what had happened from the news that had broke.
Yeah, it's horrific, isn't it? Because obviously the last thing on his mind is talking to anyone, unfortunately, because obviously they're Lynn's parents, so they deserve to know. But you would just be thinking about your immediate family. Then you've been taken into questioning, so you've not had chance anyway. But yeah, that sudden realisation just must be horrendous. And again, for the police, yes, the parents should have been informed, but again, their focus would have been on that immediate unit, that immediate family unit. So,
I just thought it's just so, it's so horrible, and for your family to find out like that. And I bet Sean actually felt bad
he'd have felt,
because he dashed to them. But like I said before, you hadn't just got your mobile phone to pick up and
no, I know.
and ring them. But at 12 p.m. that day, there was a guy called Jim Fraser who was head of forensic investigations, and he actually arrived at the crime scene to assess it.
Yeah.
With the horrific nature of the crime scene, he said that a lot of the officers were actually affected emotionally because of what had they seen, and not just like the murders, the fact that it is also children, that are involved as well. So I actually listened to an interview with Jim, and he was saying,
I found him really interesting.
It was good, wasn't I?
Yeah.
He was saying like it was such a beautiful sunny day when he arrived at the scene, and it was like very. Everything just looked picture perfect and beautiful. And then on the other hand, you've got
this horrific scene.
3 victims, and the scene was so horrific. And he just said like it was sort of hard
the juxtaposition.
To get the contrast between the two.
Yeah.
And you just thought, oh God, I bet that was awful for him to have to go to the scene. But he actually said the scene was so difficult to process because there's no flat surfaces. You've got all vegetation, you've got plants, it's all like soil.
The ground itself will be uneven.
Yeah.
You've then got like branches. He said it was quite a built up area in terms of plants.
Yeah.
And he even said that while he was trying to look for a radial blood pattern that would have been created from this kind of blunt force trauma from the wounds, you kind of look for, again, this radial pattern. However, we've talked about botany before.
Yeah.
This is where the plants come into play. Because,
I thought this was so interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know this.
No. So, effectively, quite a lot of the blood pattern would have ended up landing on ivy, which was like on the floor and then creeping up again onto the shrubbery and stuff and the crops. However, ivy follows the sun. So by this point, you've probably had a couple of hours of sunlight from potentially when they've been attacked, 4 p.m, 5 p.m, before the sun sets.
Yep.
And then you've had as early as 5 o'clock in the morning when the sun starts to come out again.
Up until when he's
got there about like between 12 and 1 midday. And what he said was that they couldn't determine a specific pattern because the ivy had moved around that much following the sun, because that's what it does. So again, do you get a botanist in? He was the head of forensic investigation for the whole of Kent Police, so they've already got a very specialist, expert out. But it's just one of those things where luckily, obviously, he's processed enough scenes and has developed a level of knowledge that he kind of acted as the botanist almost there, didn't he?
Yeah, and I mean, isn't Patricia Wiltshire from Kent?
Around that area, I think.
I was expecting to see her.
She might have made an appearance.
To see if she,
I guess if
anything.
he'd got that level of knowledge, like they all learn from each other, don't they?
So then maybe they didn't need her to come out.
Also, while he's out at the scene, they've now conducted DNA tests on the blood staining from the towels in the bag that the witness had seen.
And I'm guessing this will have taken longer as well than it does now. You can get it back within so long now, but this, just to get DNA samples back, will have taken ages, wouldn't it?
I'm assuming that the witness must have then just left the bags where they were.
Yeah.
And then obviously come forward that following morning. But ultimately they did come back as a confirmed match to the Russell victims.
Yeah.
So they now are led to believe that this witness had very likely actually seen the attacker, probably pretty instantaneously after the murders had taken place.
As that person who's the witness, like, that's scary, isn't it?
Well, you just think like, would it have been me? Could I have stopped it? Like,
because the three victims were literally just in the wrong place at the wrong time, weren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. So Jim, the forensic specialist, obviously he can't find this radial pattern. So he's then looking at the blood staining. I can't speak today. Blood staining and pooling that is also at the scene. And what they could tell was that along with the blood pools around the bodies of Lynn and Megan, there were also another 4 pools of blood.
Yeah.
And this suggested to Jim that he thinks that the bodies had potentially been moved from where the initial attack had have taken place.
Yeah.
But then as well as that, there were other pools of blood and another pool separate to those pools of blood. Again, we're talking about this, you know, that scene, multiple pools of blood.
Yeah.
For it to be a pool of blood in the first place means a significant amount of blood loss.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how the officers found it harrowing.
Yeah.
There's no wonder, is there, with the amount of
all
blood in
that.
this case. But they believed that this separate blood pool was likely from Josie's injuries.
Yeah.
And as we now know, Josie has survived at this stage.
I think while we're just on the blood, there was one more sort of blood droplet that was found, and it wasn't at the crime scene, the original crime scene.
Yeah.
So it was out on the lane, and it was just a sort of small droplet, wasn't it, when I had a look at it? And either this could indicate that something had happened outside and then the bodies had then been moved. But with it being just one droplet, they were thinking, well, there'd be more blood if something had happened there.
Yeah, probably like a trail of droplets.
Leading over.
Yeah.
So what they thought is that the weapon that had been used, because they'd all got blunt force trauma to the head, was it a drip that had come off the weapon?
Yeah.
While the offender was maybe stood next to the car trying to get in, or had stood still for a minute, the blood had then dripped off the weapon.
So again, they're trying to build up a picture of how the attack has played out, because the girls would have been on the lane, but then ultimately they've been found in this crop field further away from the lane. So how did they get there? Were they dragged, or were they told that they had to, do you know what I mean, and threatened?
Yeah.
They also then found another kind of vital piece of evidence, which was about 45 metres away from this crop field and the scene where the victims were found. And this was a bootlace. So it was one long bootlace.
Yeah.
Upon looking at it, first off, obviously you are going to have lots of walkers in the area.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have a lot of animals like dogs and things. Is that just coincidence?
Yeah.
Or is it something more sinister? Has it been used to tie the girls? They actually then assessed, obviously, the injuries to the girls, and they found that on Megan's neck, there was actually a pattern mark around her neck that mirrored the kind of weave pattern of the lace.
Yeah.
So they then believed that might have been used as a ligature. So as the head injuries,
she's then
potentially
as well.
got ligature marks.
I think as well now, like if this happened nowadays, I always think how much things have advanced, and now you'd probably be able to get skin cells off that pretty quick, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Whereas back then, I don't know how good they were at stuff like that. It's obviously before our time in forensics.
Yeah. So obviously the investigation is ongoing. They are finding evidence at the scene, but not kind of an overwhelming amount, really. They're getting an indication of what might have happened, but they're not getting an awful lot of insight into
They're not, and you sort
offender.
of, you want to look for a motive as well, and this is one thing that Jim said. He said, I wanted to sort of see if there were any sexual motives.
Yeah.
So what he actually did is to test for semen. He went back to the scene late at night and he got the UV lights out.
Yeah.
And had a look, and he said there was lots of things fluorescing, but nothing that looked like semen. So there was, in the post-mortem, there was no signs of a sexual attack on Lynn and Megan. So then he could rule that out of the investigation. Yeah. So now you've got like things like, was it motivated by money? Was it robbery? Was,
Yeah, why
have they
done
this? Yeah.
So Detective Chief Inspector Dave Stevens actually released a statement at that stage asking for witnesses to come forward. Obviously, they've got one really significant kind of witness statement. It was early on in the evening, like I've said, broad daylight. So are there other potential witnesses? So they've asked for witnesses to come forward. The post-mortems that you mentioned, they were on July the 10th. And they, again, concluded that just like Josie, they'd all suffered repeated blows from a blunt object. And at that stage, they said potentially it could have been a hammer.
Yeah.
Again, like you said, Jim then returned to the scene multiple times and found the blood on the track. He also noticed that it was almost like a drip pattern. So now you've got the post-mortem suggesting that something like a hammer's been used.
Yep.
And then you've got these droplets creating a drip pattern, which also may then have come from the weapon. So it's kind of piecing together, but we're still not getting any information about.
And Jim said
suspect.
that he thought that it might have actually started on the track and then been moved over, didn't they? Just from like the patterns and what piece of evidence they could piece together.
Yeah. Ultimately, those droplets of blood, yes, they thought that they'd have probably come from the weapon, but they hoped that the attacker might have got also injured.
Yeah.
So they tested these droplet samples, but ultimately they came back as a match to Lynn. So they've still not really got a strong enough suspect to go on. They've got someone with light coloured hair between 35 and 40, but literally nothing else at that stage. They're kind of building a picture of what's gone on, but they're still wanting forensic evidence.
They are, and I feel like over the next few months, this case doesn't go fully cold, but it's sort of, they can't seem to
catch a break, really.
Anything with it, can they? So I bet that's frustrating for the police, and especially the community as well.
And it's a really odd one, because although they've got all this blood evidence, they've got the victims, they've got a surviving victim, none of it's enough. And we've talked about this a lot now when we're saying, you know, when they don't make arrests from the off, or when it doesn't go to trial straight away, people are very quick to
criticise the police, aren't they? Yeah.
But we're now telling you that even when they've got this amount of evidence, it's still not enough. So it was actually right up till spring the following year, and they'd still not got a key suspect in the case. However,
go on.
However, miraculously, Josie had survived.
And then she could tell, well, not at this moment in time, but she was still injured. She'd had to work on like learning to do everything from scratch again. So she'd even had to learn to talk again. But this meant that she could still communicate, and the doctors were saying that she would make a full recovery. And this is the surviving witness who can give you an exact account of what's happened. So this might just be the break that the police need at this point.
But obviously, like you said, they've got to wait until it was deemed safe and a responsible enough time in which to do so. Because if you trigger someone's emotive state too soon into that recovery process, you can do an awful lot of undoing of all of that progress that's been made.
And you've got to remember, Josie now is still only 10 years old and is still recovering from her injuries. She did actually exceed all expectations with a recovery. And then police were sat by her bed all the time because they were thinking if she woke up and just said like one thing that could help the case, that they wanted someone to be there
and
all
equally,
the time.
I guess they still can't rule out that it wasn't, most attacks are stranger attacks, but they can't rule out that it isn't someone with malice that they know. That they know. So it's a really tricky one, isn't it?
So it was 6 weeks. She was in the hospital for 6 weeks, which I thought wasn't that long to say.
No, because she had a metal plate put in replacement of part of a skull because it had been just obliterated to such a degree. So thinking that she's had such horrific head injuries, a metal plate placed in replacement of her skull. Yeah. And yet 6 weeks later,
6 weeks didn't sound incredible. Very long.
But I did see an interview with someone that had said that in some of these cases, the kind of survivor mentality, even at such a young age, just kicks in and your body just fights.
Yeah. Yeah, and the police had to work really closely with Jose over a period of time to try and sort of find the best way to get the information out of her. And they decided to sort of recreate the crime scene, and they had these little dolls, little doll models. And I think that sort of worked, because it's not, you obviously can't show a 10-year-old pictures or take her back to the scene or anything like that.
No.
So you've got to find a way to trigger it, which is not going to be traumatic,
too traumatic or also too real, I guess, because they'd mocked up like the whole field and like other areas, hadn't they? It wasn't just like, this is where this horrific thing took place. They'd kind of let her with the dolls track back from
from the school, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So Josie could actually give an account of what had happened. So she had said that as they were walking home, a car had drove down Cherry Garden Lane. So they'd made it to the gate, they'd made it onto the lane, but the car had parked at some sort of angle to block them off. I think probably at this point, as a mum, like Lynn would probably have been thinking, that's strange.
Yeah.
This is a bit weird.
That's suspicious.
That's suspicious. But they walked towards the car, and there was a man sat in the front of the car who got out and went to the back door of his car and grabbed something off a parcel shelf. So at this point, I think her motherly instincts will have kicked in, and she'll have been trying to
get them past or away from, or
and he approached the family and he's demanded money from Lynn, but she's just come out to do the school run, so she's not got a purse, she's not got a handbag on her, so there's nothing that you can give him.
I'm gonna say that's awful as well, isn't it? Because you think, oh God, if I could just give him some money, he probably would leave us alone, or you'd hope that they'd leave.
Yeah, and Josie said, like, my mum even offered to go home and get some money for him.
God.
And she said that he'd said no.
Yeah.
So then you think, was he going to rob them? Is it money motivated, or is it something else? Because if it is someone who needs the money, wouldn't you take them up on the offer to go to the house? Because you know that it's quite probably an affluent area.
Yeah.
And you could probably get more out of them if you get to the house.
And didn't they also say that there was some jewellery that Lynn was wearing, but that hadn't been taken?
Yeah.
They said it probably wouldn't have been necessarily that valuable. But again, if it's someone that's so desperate for money, the likelihood is that they would have taken it regardless.
Yeah.
On the off chance.
So at this point, Lynn had shouted to Jose to run and get help. And it's just... it's horrible, isn't it? Because she's obviously turned round and ran and done what her mum said. But she said before she even got around the corner, the man had caught up with her. So he'd chased her, and must have been, because I mean, kids are fast, aren't they?
Yeah.
So, he must have been in some sort of help to be able to run. And he has then hit her with a hammer from behind on the head and dragged her back over to her family. But it wasn't, she said it wasn't like a full hit, like it, she was still injured, but she was
still conscious of what was happening.
She was sort of okay.
It's just, you can't even imagine, can you? And how quickly it would have turned from them probably laughing and running alongside the dog and
talking about school gala,
talking about whatever's happened to this just horrific attack, unprovoked attack. Ultimately, though, unfortunately, although Josie provided this really insightful account of what had happened, she wasn't able to give enough for kind of a positive ID or a more full description, really.
Yeah.
Again, it gave them insight, but it didn't give them anything in terms of the offender. There's a car that's been mentioned again, so we've now got a repeat of this car. Is it now money motivated? But again, they weren't sure because of the...
It's all like not sure, isn't it? It's all very like, unsure. And Josie did give like a description, but she said as a man in his 20s with blonde spiky hair. So now we've still got the light coloured hair, but now we've got an age range from, she said in her 20s, but does a 10-year-old really know what someone in their 20s looks like?
And also she's 10 now, but obviously she'd have been even younger at the time. So it's like, you've got no concept.
Because if you ask people how old we are, a 10-year-old is probably going to say I'm 40, whereas like a 20-year-old will probably say I'm in my 20s.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's a total different...
perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
So by July, there were still no strong leads, unfortunately. But again, we've spoken about it before, they decided to go on Crime Watch. I'm going to start a petition for Crime Watch to come back because, honest to God...
I used to watch Crime Watch all the time.
Yeah, the amount of cases that it's helped. So they went out with another appeal. They actually did a reconstruction of that day, and they did include an e-fit that had been created by that eyewitness who had seen potentially the murderer after the attack.
Yeah.
And this provided, again, a significant lead, which then led to a suspect named Michael Stone. So Michael Stone was actually known to a number of services. So in his later kind of life, he was known to drug services, probation services, psychiatry and mental health services. But then when he was younger, he'd also been through the care system. So he was quite well known. And when obviously investigators start speaking to people that know Stone, they find out that he'd actually been visited by his psychiatrist team and that he'd gone to their like centre or whatever, clinical centre, and that they'd said he was significantly agitated, he was making threats to kill his probation officer and their family, which again, so you've now got threats to a whole family.
And this was all in the lead up in the few days before the murders of Lynn and Megan. Yeah.
And so they then flagged him as being like having potential to be an offender. Yeah. Police then use a profiler to effectively justify or validate whether or not he would have fit the profile for this kind of crime, because yes, he was known to services in the past and had committed other offences, but they did tend to be kind of drug related. This is a horrific.
Yeah, it's a bit of a leap, isn't it?
Yeah, big step up.
But he actually came onto the radar because his psychiatrist saw the e-fit and rang the police and said, "This looks like my patient." And he's been acting weird. So that in general, I just think is mad, isn't it? When you see the e-fit and think, oh, does that look like someone? Because I saw the e-fit and you could have probably fit that to looking like a few people.
Most people, yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It was quite vague.
It was.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh God, how did they feel?
I know. And as a psychiatrist as well, you kind of just think like, it must be difficult because you don't want to, these people have got really complex mental illness.
Yeah.
So you don't want to be pinning, a potential double and attempted murder on one of your patients if it turns out not to be true, because they're obviously going through things themselves. But the way that he was acting obviously had made threats to other people. The profiler did then confirm that he would have fit the offender profile.
Yeah.
So a year after the murders, Stone was then arrested.
Yeah. And like you said, the stuff that he'd got arrested for before, it was sort of a bit of a jump. But in 1981, he did actually attack a man with a hammer and he was charged with GBH and robbery. So that's where the hammer link came in.
Yeah.
In 1983, he stabbed a man he knew in the chest while he was asleep. And then in 1987, he also received a 10-year sentence for armed robbery.
Yeah.
But he did have a heroin addiction. So a lot of the crimes that he committed were robberies to get money for
drugs.
But
again, a lot of those crimes had taken place over 40 miles away, which might not sound like a massive amount.
But if you don't drive and you can't get around.
But it was in one of these like groups of coastal towns that are quite small, but they're by an estuary of the River Medway. And again, kind of intelligence about that area basically stated that it used to be quite large industrial, a large industrial area.
Shipping area.
Yeah, where all these little towns, all these little lovely coastal towns then were great for workers. However, that kind of industry had become less and less over the years, and there did then tend to be more instances of drug use and alcoholism and stuff like that. But again, if you think about people with drug addictions and addictions in general that are committing crimes to try and fund those habits, they tend to be in built-up cities where they can get access to quick cash.
Yeah.
So they're committing crimes, but then they can literally probably walk 5 minutes down the road and get access to those drugs that they are wanting.
Yeah.
So although he fit the profile to some degree, they were also questioning why he would be committing an offence on such a rural back road, not near to any of these kind of facilities that he'd have wanted to access.
Yeah.
So Stone had actually been working as a police informant as well. So he'd been known to again, as I say, all these services for over 20 years of his life. He's only like 30 at this stage. And they decide that he can provide like low-level intel.
Yeah.
So they'd got a very good awareness of him as a suspect.
Yeah.
But there's no direct evidential link to him and the crime.
A lot of it is just all circumstantial, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah. So 14 months after, yes, they've got him as a lead suspect, but there's still not enough evidence to actually charge him. He ended up being put in Canterbury prison on a segregation unit for another crime. And at that point, he did actually make a confession to another inmate called Damien Daly, who then goes to prison staff and says, "I've just heard Stone confess." And then they passed it on to the police.
Yeah, he said he actually confessed through a pipe that ran between the cells, and that's how the inmates would talk when they're in the segregation unit.
And 2 prison officers then kind of backed this up. They said that, yes, you can hear them through these pipes. And it was 2 officers, Barry Thompson and Mark Jennings, and they effectively backed up this statement in support of the confession.
Yeah.
Over a year and a half then goes by, again, to get the case ready to go to trial, which is understandable when we explain it. But it ultimately began in October 1998. And Jim, the head of forensics for Kent Police, gave evidence at the trial. But he kind of referred to the evidence that was just at the scene rather than evidence which directly related back to Stone.
Yeah.
So he talked more about what he'd found, and yes, well, it's like we've already said, yes, it's all good evidence, but it doesn't specifically link the offender to the scene. So while prosecutors that were claiming it was a frenzied attack, the location suggested that they'd been led into that field. So
it was more prolonged.
So again, that didn't kind of necessarily make sense. Plus, they'd got the vehicle there and everything. So it was quite a difficult and complex trial. It was also put to the court that bootlace could have been used as a tourniquet, but not only a tourniquet around Megan's neck, but also for drug use.
Yeah, so that would link to Stone, but again, it's not any solid evidence,
no, it's not actually, like it's all hypothetical.
It's a theory, yeah.
It's hypothetical at that point. Again, we mentioned that Josie had been interviewed numerous times and her video interviews were played in court, which again must have just been harrowing for the jury and everyone that was in that public gallery to have witnessed. They were trying to prove, the prosecution were trying to prove that Stone had lied to the police on numerous occasions, again saying that he hadn't ever had a hammer in his car, he'd got no knowledge of the area. But he had briefly lived in a children's home around the area, and apparently a friend of his had come forward and said that they'd driven around the area together before and he'd pointed places out.
He knew his way around it, enough to direct someone.
But this is also circumstantial. So it's proven really difficult. 2 former associates of Michael Stone then came forward and said that they'd seen him in the days after the attack and he looked really dishevelled, he'd got blood on his clothing, and that they thought that he was the offender. However, this was then discredited because a police officer and, again, the mental health teams that Stone was under had seen him numerous times and they declared the complete opposite.
Yeah.
They said he
were even clean-shaven.
Yeah, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, and none of that was true.
Yeah.
So it was a really difficult trial, but ultimately the jury returned with a verdict, and it was a 10-2 majority that did in fact find Stone guilty of the murders.
And I think he kicked off a bit after this, and he actually had to be restrained, but he was sentenced to 3 life sentences.
Yeah.
So even though Josie survived, he still got one for the attempted murder of Josie.
Obviously, this would have been incredibly high profile and was incredibly high profile. And a day later, Thompson, one of the witnesses, actually declared to the press that he told a pack of lies.
It was so strange, this, because all of a sudden, he just went out and spoke to the press and said, everything I said in there was a lie, I didn't confess.
So you just think, what?
Your whole case is basically resting on these pieces of evidence from inmates, but then it just begs the question, doesn't it? How reliable are these people?
Yeah,
that
is
are
he
already
coming forward to try and get
activity?
a good life in prison, kind of thing? Yeah. So at that point, Hampshire police actually had to conduct an investigation into the way that the Kent police had processed the investigation, and it took 3 years before they then confirmed that there was no issue with the investigation and the officers had done everything that they could. But again, that must be so disheartening for the team that actually worked the case.
Yeah, because you've done
They've
your
done their
best
utmost and it's all been brought into question.
So because of the evidence being found to be a lie, Stone could then file for an appeal. So on the 8th of February 2001, the Court of Appeal said that because the witnesses that had heard Stone confess had been paid by the newspaper as well, that it was obviously not reliable evidence. So they actually ordered a retrial, but they didn't want the current, because it was in Kent and obviously it was public knowledge, it was all over the news, it was a local case. They didn't want that to impact the retrial, and so they actually moved it up to Nottingham. And I think people will have heard about it, but if it was like 3 years ago, well, not even 3 years ago by now, it's longer. They wouldn't know as much about it, and it's like a fresh jury.
Yeah. So on the 5th of September 2001, this retrial begins, and at this stage, there's only Damien's testimony used.
Yeah.
But no further forensic evidence has been found. Actually, what they did, which I found fascinating, obviously from a forensic linguistic perspective,
I knew you were going to like that,
was that they decided to question and test how reliable this supposed confession via pipes in a prison would have been in terms of being able to hear like properly what had been said. So they actually took all of the jurors and some of the prosecution and the defence back down to Kent to go into the prison and actually test out between the 2 cells whether or not you could hear via the pipes. And they actually had someone, again, a sound expert, read an extract of Harry Potter. Wouldn't have been my choice.
Well. Yeah.
But to actually test how well they could have and whether or not they could have heard Stone's confession. So the jury were going in and out of these 2 cells to kind of to
and
listen.
all the way from Nottingham as well to Kent.
Just
to be like
big,
in and out of cells.
Like, it's so odd. You don't never hear of like a whole jury going out on a day trip to look at evidence. So again, they were really trying. It did feel a bit like they were trying to like clutch at straws to get the evidence across. But after 11 hours of deliberation, ultimately Stone was again found guilty on 3 counts of murder. There are still questions as to whether or not this is enough to prove his guilt. Stone is now, imprisoned.
If this happened nowadays, would Stone be convicted on this evidence? And probably not.
And even Jim, the forensic specialist, said that there wasn't any forensic evidence that directly linked Stone to the murder. He said, I just spoke about what was there, but I didn't speak about anything that related to Stone.
And while all this is going on, there is obviously people who are saying, well, there's not a lot of evidence. So is Stone really guilty? Is an innocent man being convicted for a second time?
There were also hairs that had been found at the scene, but they were tested to not belong to any of the victims or Stone. So then they're saying, so has someone else been there? It's just so shaky.
The car was never found. And in some of the witness statements, they'd also described the man that they saw at the scene as being of stocky build. And Jose even said in her statement that she described the man's build as being like the police officer. The police officer was about 20 stone. So we know that Stone was a heroin addict, so he was very small and thin. Whereas someone being 20 stone, there's a massive discrepancy there. But why did they not go and do, obviously it's Josie's account. She was the one that was actually there. But then again, she is still only 10 years old.
And then there were other things that were brought into question. So Stone didn't have an alibi for the time of the offence, but given his last location where he'd been seen, it would have taken him at least an hour to get to the scene of the crime. So again, even they said that was tight in terms of whether or not he'd have physically been able to do it, commit the offence. Motive-wise, we've already mentioned, they weren't sure that if he was committing this offence in order to get money, that it would have happened where it did, in the way it did. It was shaky.
It was. And in all the documentaries or articles or anything you listen to on this, there is always someone else named. And this leads on from couple of weeks ago on our episode where we spoke about Levi Belfield, and a lot of people are convinced that Levi Belfield had something to do with it. In terms of the fate of being stocky, 20 stone, he had blonde spiky hair at the time. We've got the beige car, which he did have access to a beige car, but at the same time, Levi's ex-girlfriend actually alibied him for the day of these murders. And she said, I remember exactly what we were doing on that day because it was my birthday. So we were celebrating my birthday at the time.
Her account of that day is incredibly detailed.
She knew exactly what she did.
She went from literally him cooking a breakfast in the morning right till the end of the day. She can talk you through it kind of blow by blow.
And I don't think she'd mislead the police, because in the Levi Belfield case, we actually spoke about the ex-girlfriend a lot. And she was the one who went to the police about him originally. So the police decided that her alibi for Levi Belfield at the time was credible. But then Levi actually did a written confession while in prison and confessed to the murder.
So in 2017, he said they'd got nothing to do with it. But then was it months or a year or so later, then provided this 4-page written confession. But again, the likelihood is that at this stage, he just wants to stay relevant, get the notoriety and stay in the media. There's no proof, there's no evidence, obviously, otherwise they'd have looked into it, that he's involved. There was mention of this beige car, but that didn't match the actual type of car that Joe Collins had. Yes, Hammer was involved, but it was, in Belfield's case, they tended to all be near bus stops. There's no actual evidence, there's no proof. So it's just a theory.
So Levi Belfield, as we know, is already in prison anyway for all the murders that he committed. But I'd like to finish on sort of where Josie is now and her dad and what they've managed to do.
Very quickly before you do that, just to say that Stone actually appealed a second time, and that was in 2005. But then by 2011, his team were then refused permission again to apply for a judicial review of that initial decision. So he's still serving the sentences, and he's not been allowed a further appeal.
So where are they now? Sean and Jose actually left Granary Cottage, not surprisingly. You wouldn't want to be in the area. And they actually moved back to North Wales. So that is where they moved from beforehand. And Jose is a successful textiles artist. And Sean Russell is now a lead horticultural expert at the University of Bangor. But Josie actually makes landscapes from recycled materials.
Incredible.
So you can actually check out her website as well and see what she's doing. So it's www.josierussell.com, and she's got all her artwork on there as well. And I just thought that's really nice to know that they moved away together and they've still got each other. And
that's what I mean. Yeah, it's just someone to share in that, and as tragic as it is, and they have lost half of their family, at least they've got each other. Yeah. So another pretty intense case for you there. Hopefully it flowed.
I feel like that was in a good order. It was just like start to finish, wasn't it? So we're all right with that one.
And let us know in the comments what you think. Do you think that if that went to trial today, it would still have the same outcome? And do you think that obviously if the crime had have taken place today rather than back in 1996, whether or not they could have gained any further evidence? It's one that we'll probably never know.
Yeah.
So thanks again for listening. Hopefully you join us again for the next episode. So take care.
Bye.